This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. Most of the time in this series, we talk about limited gameplay, how to play better limited and stuff like that. But today we're doing something a little bit different because Mark Rosewater put out his annual Nuts and Bolts column this week. And it's about how play boosters are structured in order to create what they call good limited formats. And I thought it would be interesting to go over this article a little bit together and talk about whether or not it really is good for limited formats. All right, so play boosters, of course, made their debut in Murders at Karlov Manor. They're a little bit different than what we've had for a while in draft boosters. But like I said in the video I did on when play boosters were announced, it's not like it's had this huge, massive effect on the limited format. More rares show up, but they're, most packs still only have one rare. You do see 2 rares more often, but the 3 and 4 rare packs are exceedingly rare, so it doesn't have a huge impact on limited. But this article is interesting because it talks about this set skeleton that they put in place to make good limited formats. Now, he's talked about set skeletons before, back in 2021, but he didn't focus as much on limited in that article as he does in this one. Obviously, play boosters being only really there for limited mostly makes it a little bit different for him to discuss. It talks about the difference in rarity breakdown, the biggest change being that there are more uncommons. That's not something I'm that interested in discussing, but what I am interested in taking a look at is this set skeleton for each color, and overall what we're going to see is that there's this sort of paint by numbers limited design, which has its benefits. Basically every set has a lot of the same elements so that, they know what works and they know what doesn't work, and they don't want to deviate too much from it when they are making limited formats. But this is also has a con, I think. We haven't had like an outright terrible limited format in some time. It's pretty hard to do that with this paint by numbers style, but I think I'd also say we haven't had a great limited format in a long time. And I think, consistently solid to above average limited formats are cool and all, but a great limited format probably has to deviate from this paint by numbers thing that we're looking at here in order to truly be great, because if every set's kind of the same, that turns out that's why all these sets feel the same. So for example, they make sure that there are lots of common creatures, at lower mana values and fewer at higher mana values. This makes sense. In the earliest days of limited, pre-Mirage Block, which was the first time they really designed with limited in mind, lots of sets just didn't take curve into account at all because people weren't really thinking about limited, and it is an important thing. This isn't something that bothers me that much. I think you probably do need to keep this sort of thing in mind. They have pushed 1 and 2 mana creatures more lately. Whether they need to keep doing that, maybe we can have a debate about. But the fact of the matter is that, you do need to make sure that each color has like a decent curve, because if any color is really shafted there, it creates big problems. So having these commons, multiple 2 mana creatures, multiple 3 mana creatures, always 1 mana creature, that's fine. That part doesn't bother me that much. Should they deviate it from it from time to time? Maybe, but this I can understand them doing. Where I think it gets less interesting, more problematic. Well, we have a few things here. First, they have a keyword distribution at common. So, this makes some sense. You're going to see some differences as we move through this article in terms of color pie things. So white gets lots of flyers. It usually gets about 3 flyers at common, a couple creatures with vigilance at common, and 1 lifelinker with low power at common. And then occasionally it'll get first strike or double strike, right? Normally those are keywords you see at uncommon. This, again, I don't have any huge problem with it in theory, I guess. But you can tell when you're playing limited, like even before this article, it was pretty obvious that they had certain things they wanted to check off of a checklist in every limited format over the last, several years. And we're kind of seeing that checklist now, basically. He's showing us the checklist, And, like I've already said, I think some of this is important, but I think you've got to deviate sometimes. And, he does say in this article, I should note, that these are not things that are set in stone, that are never going to change, but this is kind of the baseline. And even having that baseline, to me, I don't know how much I love it when it really extends into keywords and then into different kinds of common spells. So, combat-related removal for white, yeah. We always have a card that says, like, destroy target attacking or blocking creature. We've always got a banishing light effect, an exile target creature enchantment. We've always got a decent combat trick at 1 or 2 mana. We've always got, kind of a janky disenchant / removal spell. Sometimes the same card is both. It's modal. Yeah, I mean, these are things we see in every single set, but I'm not convinced that's a good thing. I don't necessarily want there to be a banishing light in every set. I don't want there to be combat related removal all the time. I'd like if these things would change more, but these, if you look through recent sets, these are all things that we've been seeing lately. And you can see how things have changed, which is also interesting because this is talking about like 2021 versus today and how limited has changed since then. For one thing, they don't always necessarily have auras or equipment. Most of them end up being bad and limited. They don't always have a mass pump effect, although we do, of course, have one in Karlov Manor. And now the destroy artifact enchantment thing is usually a modal spell, which I think that's probably a good thing. Also, the pacifism effects have been replaced by banishing light. So, there are fewer slots. That's why there are fewer, common slots shown here. But yeah, I mean, like I've been saying, to some degree, I understand doing this. But you could do something more interesting, because this is how it feels at this point. We have this in every set. Why don't you replace one of these things with something else, something different? And we do get decent auras sometimes that change things up, but, overall, this is what we're seeing in white every single set. He doesn't go into as much depth about uncommons. There is at least a lot more leeway about those, which I think is good. Commons having these sort of checklist things makes, again, some degree of sense. But when it comes to uncommons, they just make sure that there are more creatures than non-creatures. And beyond that, uncommons can get more complicated and be different than this sort of stack of effects that we see in every single set. So then you move into blue, and you can see some of the color pie differences. Blue doesn't always get a 1-mana creature. And it gets fewer creatures overall, which makes a lot of sense. Here's the keyword distribution here. Again, lots of flying. You've got some vigilance, which that one is weird to me because how often do we see vigilance in blue, right? Not that often. So I'm not really sure. Like, we definitely don't see 1.5 commons on average every set with vigilance, unless I've lost my mind or something. I feel like we see more ward than this too. But yeah, defender and flash, these are the keywords. Apart from vigilance, which seems really out of place here. The others are all like, yeah, you see those in blue. But then again, we've got this kind of paint by numbers thing. And it is interesting. It is, again, interesting to look at because this is how things have felt. You get a protective instant. By this, they mean like a hex-proof instant. You get some random counter spell. You get a cantrip, a 1 or 2 mana card that replaces itself and has a small effect, in other words. You get a like draw 2 divination type effect. You get a witness protection aura, which, these usually aren't very good and limited. It's kind of weird to me that they want this to be a slot, like they got rid of pacifism as a regular slot because it's not good enough anymore. But these are even worse because they're comparable. They don't fully remove a creature in most cases. They turn the creature into something smaller in most of the time. Some of them have been better. We've seen a couple with flash lately that make it more interesting, but those are the higher rarity ones generally. And then, yeah, you get a top or bottom spell. This means a time ebb effect. We've seen it a lot lately. 4 mana, your opponent puts a creature on top or bottom of their library. And then you get some sort of modal spell. That one's sort of vague, but, it means probably a spell that has like an overcosted draw effect or an overcosted bounce effect as its options. And again, you can see how things have changed. We don't get as much counter magic, which, it's interesting lately. I think on average, maybe we only get 1 counter spell at common, but the one we get at common has actually been good. whereas these like hard and soft counter spells we used to get usually weren't very good. So that's interesting. I think a lockdown aura makes way more sense than witness protection auras for limited. This means one that, you know, freezes a creature down, keeps it from untapping. Then you have all these other slots. You know, blue having a combat trick is a little bit weird. Putting it on your witness protection effect makes the most sense. So I understand getting rid of that. Yeah, so you can see how things have changed, how they are now in play boosters. Again, do we need these things every set? Can we do something different at common? I hope so. So obviously blue gets fewer creatures at uncommon and more non-creatures. Blue often has a theme of course, spells. Then we move into black. It has a pretty aggressive curve like white does, unsurprisingly, as we can see here. Here we have the keyword breakdown. You know, you get a couple of flyers, you get a menace creature, you get a death touch creature, and you get a life linker. You get all these things at common. I do think it's good to make sure, like, you don't want too many death touchers, especially because they are a huge pain to play against. You don't want too many death touchers at common. You know, menace and flying are both nice forms of evasion for black. You also don't want too much lifelink at common because it can also be really frustrating, but having it around makes sense. So the common spells and play boosters, you get the small conditional removal, you get a combat trick, you get a card draw spell. Usually it's like draw 2, lose 2 for 3. You get coercion, which I don't know why they want to do this. You know, this is another effect that's almost always bad. It isn't always. We've had a few exceptions to this, like the Power Stone one from March of the Machine, or I guess that was Brothers War, actually. But most of the time, these aren't good. The one in Karlov Manor isn't good, so I don't know why you want to spend a slot on that. You could do something more interesting. Unconditional removal, usually it's an expensive spell. And then they even have here slightly overcosted removal, you know. So this one is more like a murder slot, so it's reasonably efficient. It's like 3 mana. The slightly overcosted removal is like, you know, 5 or 6 mana. Destroy a creature, maybe get some small effect. But it's funny to me that this is what they call that slot. I do think it's good to have, you know, having these sort of like C- level cards that you just have to run when you need removal sometimes makes things interesting. You can see how things have changed. You know, red used to get, or black used to get 3 to 4 removal spells, which is kind of insane. That's a little too much. You get, you know, the card draw is the same. It's interesting to me that they don't have a raised dead effect on the left here, because we see that in like every set too. I think it basically is at common. You know, that's a card that gets you creatures back from your graveyard into your hand. The discard slots filled by coercion, and then, you know, positive aura or combat trick. We just don't see auras anymore, basically. I mean, you know, not very often. Some sets have them where it's a big theme, but if it doesn't, we don't see very many of them. So yeah, that's black. It's about even between creatures and non-creatures. You know, that makes sense. Black likes its disruptive spells and removal spells and stuff, but it likes creatures too. Then we move to red, which also has a nice aggressive curve, as you'd expect. It also has an interesting distribution of keywords. You get a trampler, a menace creature, and a haste creature at common most of the time. These days we also get reach most sets, which, you know, that didn't used to be the reddest ability, but it has pretty much become one. And I think that makes sense. You know, you can see that red doesn't get flying at common, and that's some nice balance to add. That also feels color pie-ish. You know, red doesn't usually get flyers unless they're big, scary dragons. So given some small creature reach makes more sense. And then it gets access to first strike and double strike at common on occasion. Once again, we've got, you know, the shock effect, which we see all the time, 1 mana deal 2. We've got a combat trick. You know, red usually gets a pretty good one. You usually have some sort of rummaging impulse draw effect. This means cards that make you discard and then draw, or cards that exile cards from the top of your library, and you can play them over some amount of time. You get a modal shatter, which most limited formats isn't very good. You get a direct damage spell, and this is usually a deal 4. So they even have this sort of checked off, you know, how much damage these spells do. This worries me a little bit because some sets have higher toughness creatures that there are, or lower toughness, and these spells get better or worse depending on that. So if they aren't careful to adjust numbers from like 4 or 6 for these, you know, 2 common slots, it's you know, it's not great. I don't think so. Hopefully they're more careful with that than this would indicate. You know, you can see the kind of effects that have sort of been retired or reduced or moved up to a higher rarity. Still have the direct damage things, but Red doesn't really get mass pump effects that often. It doesn't get land destruction because it's not good in limited. A steal or direct damage effect, and it says ineffective. So, you know, if you have to put ineffective next to a card that you're putting in your limited packs, probably just shouldn't have it. You know, the draw effect has been replaced by rummaging impulse draw. Again, we've seen positive aura equipment fall off of all of these lists. Can't block effect and so forth. Red, interestingly, also is pretty evenly divided between creatures and non-creatures, which I guess, you know, red likes spells a lot of the time, but I feel like there should be a little more creature focused than non-creature, but, you know. Then we move to green, where we've got, you know, the creatures are divided. As you'd expect, they have more big creatures than the others, but they've also got a decent lower curve. Keyword distribution here, you know, green kind of has everything but flying, right? Vigilance, Trample, Reach, Death Touch, Ward, more recent edition, and a tiny bit of haste. I feel like that number should be even lower. I mean, green does get haste sometimes, but it feels like it's usually at uncommon or higher, but maybe we're about to see that change, I guess. I mean, this just means it shows up like 1 out of 5 sets at common, so it's not like it's showing up a lot, but still, you know, and this is what you'd expect if you've been playing limited lately. The non-creature spells are a fight spell. That means one where your creature does damage and gets damaged by the thing it damages. A bite spell, which is where only your creature damages your opponent's creature. Green usually gets great combat tricks. Here it says Power Pump specifically. You know, usually it gets 2 mana for like +4/+4, or 2 mana for +3/+3 and Trample. You know, you get those big effects. Green, in terms of like the impact of its tricks, is usually the highest. Some mana acceleration, you know, rampant growth effect, in other words. And then, you know, green's card draw slot is filled by cards that say, like, you know, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put a land and or creature from among them into your hand, and the other 2 in the graveyard or whatever. Once again, we can see, you know, the things that have been dropped. You know, you don't get a naturalize anymore. Aura and equipment is dropped again. You know, the anti-flying doesn't show up that much. You can just give creatures reach. And it's just better to put things on creatures most of the time anyway. So, yeah. You do see here that green has a ton of creatures and not that many non-creatures. So that's kind of what you'd expect. And then you move to multicolor. You know, this, you know, usually you have these uncommon signpost uncommons. We're seeing more of them lately. I guess we're going to see more, you know, 2 of them instead of just 1 in most color pairs, which I think can be good. You know, it's been interesting. We've had bad archetypes lately, even when they have multiple signposts. So, you know, it does have some interesting stuff to say here, though, about all of this. It says, one of the biggest changes from draft boosters to play boosters was a decision to increase from 1 multicolor card per 2 color combination to 2. So that I already mentioned. One is an enabler, helping make the archetype work. The other will be a strong payoff for doing what the archetype is telling you to do. So, you know, one of them is like a synergy piece that helps you do the thing that your other cards do, and the other one does the thing. So, you know, that is, I think, a good way overall of designing it. Obviously, this changes. You know, there are multicolor focused sets where you have more, where you have some at common and stuff like that. But, yeah, overall, I think this is probably a good thing. Synergy is more fun in most limited formats, and if they're trying to push it more, that's okay, provided things aren't really busted. You know, the artifact situation is similar to what we've seen. You get some random ones at common. Usually they're not very good. And then the common non-creatures, you get in artifacts. You know, you have some form of fixing, land fixing, and then you have like a manolith, which is, you know, an artifact that taps for mana. And then you usually have some overcosted removal. You can see we don't really get equipment at common anymore. Other than that, it looks pretty much the same. So, yeah, another interesting thing for limited that he mentions here is specifically that each 2-color draft archetype should have at least 6 support cards, 2 monocolor commons and 2 monocolor uncommons, usually 1 in each color, and 2 multicolor cards, which we already talked about. So, you know, that stuff I think is good. It does seem to me like there's more of that for some color pairs still. Like, that kind of balance isn't always there. Like, if you watch my archetype guide for Karlov Manor, some color pairs have way more payoff cards than others. And that doesn't always mean the archetype is better. You know, it depends on the format, but I do think having more balance there is better. I mean, you know, this isn't a set where it happens, but a lot of the time blue-green has like no real identity. You know, in Karlov Manor, blue-green's actually pretty good and it does have an identity. But there are lots of sets where it doesn't. Why does that happen? You know, it's like, in some ways it seems like they're following this in ways that I think is detrimental to limited formats. And they're also ignoring their own, you know, directives when it comes to limited formats. And that's not great. So, yeah, overall, this is a really interesting article. You know, you can go read it yourself. I'll put the link in the description. It's hard to say, you know, is this a net negative or a net positive for limited? It might just kind of be a wash, but I do think, like I said at the beginning, you know, you have this situation where limited formats aren't complete disasters because the curve's messed up or they don't have enough removal in a particular color. We have all of that pretty much sorted out in a way that limited formats aren't disasters, but it also makes these sets feel more and more the same lately. You know, they've become fast. You know, you've seen how the creature distribution is. Every color has multiple 2-drops. Most of them have at least one 1-drop slot at common. And that, you know, we don't need to always have that, I don't think. I think they need to have more flexibility. And I'm hoping that this isn't like what's going to happen all the time from now on. Again, the article does say they deviate from this, but this is sort of the baseline. But to some extent, it worries me that this is the baseline at all. So that's kind of my take on all of this. You know, limited's not going to die because of this or anything like that. But maybe it won't ever be great again. I hope it will, personally. But it hasn't been for a while. It's just been, you know, average to good. All right, so that'll do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including me talking about, you know, the introduction of play boosters a few months back, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.